In this video, we'll be going over the best anti-support cards, where instead of benefiting an entire type of cards or archetypes, these are kind of designed with the opposite intent in mind, and could be considered incredibly specific counter cards to an extent. And at number 10, we have Poisonous Winds. This is a continuous spell card which is anti-support for the Wind attribute, where while it's face up on the field, wind monsters can't be special summoned, and all the ones on the field lose 500 attack. Now, the 500 attack decrease is a nice bonus on top of a really good first effect, where it's just straight up a floodgate to an entire attribute of monsters. If a continuous spell card existed like this but for the Dark attribute, it would probably be banned tomorrow, although Poisonous Winds hasn't really seen play since 2016, because the Wind attribute is just nowhere near as popular. The card did see some competitive play when Magispector cards first came out, as that was an entire pendulum archetype which special summoned pretty regularly and had a broken boss monster that could bounce cards during both players' turns. Although once that card got banned, the archetype kinda stopped seeing play immediately afterwards, and there hasn't really been a meta wind archetype since. There's been some that have had wind attribute cards as part of their engine, and probably a few archetypes that have played heavy wind monsters, but none of those were super competitive. So once a super broken tier 0 deck comes out that's all about wind monsters, expect to see Poisonous Winds to see a lot more play in the extra deck, because the ability to just shut down all special summons of a type of monster is pretty strong. And there's a reason there aren't really other anti-support cards like this for other attributes, outside of maybe the barrier statue cards. And at number 9, we have Ally of Justice Cycle Reader. This is a hand trap that allows you to discard this card to the graveyard in order to banish up to 2 light monsters from your opponent's graveyard. Now, the entire Ally of Justice archetype is anti-support for the light attribute, although it's kind of infamous for being really bad at it, with only a handful of the Ally of Justice cards actually doing a good job of countering light cards, with Ally of Justice Cycle Reader being one of the best main deck Ally of Justice cards to accomplish what the archetype is trying to do. Basically, it's just a DD Crow, but only for light monsters, and allows you to get rid of 2 of them instead of 1. So this card sees occasional play over the years because the light attribute is kind of one of the more popular ones, the 3rd most popular after Dark and Earth anyway, and if you're playing against a light attribute deck, there's a good chance this card might be useful against them. Like the ABC Dragon Buster deck, for example. They're all about getting their materials for their boss monster into the graveyard, because that's the best place to use them in order to bring out their boss monster. So as soon as they get any 2 of their materials in the grave, you can just use this one in order to get rid of them so they can't use them as materials for their fusion monster. It's also a level 3 tuner, so it has some synergies with Synchro decks and how Quiferbacks combos, just like a lot of the other hand traps. And with how much use DD Crow has seen over the years, it's no surprise that Ally of Justice Cycle Reader has seen a lot of play over the years as well, and is definitely the 2nd most played Ally of Justice card in the history of the game, right behind Ally of Justice Cataster. And I don't think there is a 3rd most played card. The rest of the archetype is pretty garbage. And at number 8, we have Buster Blader the Dragon Destroyer Swordsman. The entire Buster Blader archetype is kind of anti-dragon support, just like the Ally of Justice is supposed to be anti-light, except the Buster Blader archetype is much better at its job of being anti-dragon, especially their boss monster, who has the effect that, while it's on the field, it negates and changes to defense position all of your opponent's dragon-type monsters. It also gains 1000 attack and defense for each of your opponent's dragons on the field and in their graveyard, and deals piercing battle damage. So it's kind of the poster boy for how to create a card which counters something else completely. It's so good at countering dragons that it actually sees competitive play sometimes, thanks to some of the other support cards that allow it to change some of your opponent's cards to dragon type. The Buster Dragon archetype is kind of one good card away from being broken from how good this floodgate effect is, as they have a really good trap card that allows you to fusion summon from the graveyard using materials in the graveyard, a link monster that allows you to set all that up, a synchro monster that changes all of your opponent's monsters into dragon type, and the biggest problem with the archetype though is the amount of high level monsters in it, and that's just a tiny bit too inconsistent and bricky because of it, and is very reliant on you getting out cards that change your opponent's types to dragons, because it's excellent anti-support, but doesn't really do much against other types of cards. So it's just a tiny bit too inconsistent to see too much competitive play. And at number 7, we have Doom King Balerdroch. This card is kind of cheating a little bit for this, since it technically is anti-support for the zombie attribute, But the only reason it has anti-support is because of their field spell card, Zombie World, which changes all monsters on the field in both players' graveyards to zombie type. And the card very obviously requires a field spell card to be on the field in order to use its effects to the fullest, so it's intended to be comboed with that card. As what this card does is if this card is in your graveyard, during the standby phase, if there is a card in the field zone, you can special summon this card from the graveyard in defense position. Then it has a Spell Speed 2 effect, where if a zombie type monster activates its effect, you can chain one of its 2 effects to that monster, where you can either negate that monster's effect or banish one card on the field or graveyard. And you can use both of these effects once per turn, just not during the same chain. So if you have Zombie World out and your opponent activates a monster effect, you can negate it since it's anti-zombie support. Or you can banish a card on the field by using one of your own zombie monster effects. This card is kind of a beast boss monster for the zombie type, as it brings itself out super easily, has 2 great effects on the field, and also has high stats for all the stuff that it does and how easy it is to hit the field. And at number 6, we have Tellarknight Constellar Diamond. This is a rank 5 Xyz monster which has an alternative summoning condition where you can just rank it up on top of another Tellarknight Xyz monster you control, instead of going through its normal materials of 3 or more level 5 light monsters. And this card has a floodgate and an anti-support effect, where, while it has Xyz materials, neither player can send cards from their deck to the graveyard, and if you try to recycle a card from the graveyard to your hand, it gets banished. Now, there are a lot of cards in the ban list who have effects to send a card from the deck to the graveyard, because that effect is just so good and is used in so many different kinds of decks. So is recursion from the graveyard, so those are both excellent floodgates. On top of that, it also has an anti-dark effect, where if your opponent activates a dark monster effect, you can detach one of its materials to negate and destroy that card. So since this card is actually not that hard to bring out, if you just rank it up on top of a Tellarknight monster, it has seen pretty consistent play ever since it was released, since it has a great floodgate and an anti-dark effect, which will have a very high chance to be live because of how numerous that attribute is. Plus, the Tellarknights have a card which can change your opponent's monsters into the dark attribute. It definitely stopped seeing play as much once Master Rule 4 came out, but it didn't stop like a lot of other Xyz cards. It was so good that it kept seeing play even through the heavy limitations of Xyz cards, which should show you something about how good the card is, and just how many dark attribute meta archetypes there are out there. And at number 5, we have Set Rotation. This card is anti-support for field spell cards, and ironically is very good at getting field spell cards on the field, as what it does is it allows you to set 2 field spell cards with different names from your deck to both sides of the field. And while either of those cards is set on the field, neither player can activate or set other field spell cards besides the ones you set with Set Rotation. So what some decks would do with Set Rotation was just use it to get 2 different field spell cards that they might want on the field or in the graveyard. That way they could gain the effect twice. Or more commonly, they would give their opponent a field spell card that they couldn't activate, like Gateway to Chaos. Or just set a field spell card on your side of the field and never activate it, so your opponent can't use a field spell card. It was incredibly useful to the player who used it first without too much downsides, which is why the card eventually got limited and has kind of stayed there ever since. Field spell cards for a lot of archetypes are super strong, and some decks are kind of balanced around how strong their field spell card is. So having an easy way to search out your field spell card, while also locking your opponent out of theirs all in one, is just a little bit too strong. So it's kind of just seen consistent play over the years, and probably won't stop seeing play until it gets banned. And at number 4, we have Shadow Imprisoning Mirror. This card is anti-support to the dark attribute, where, while it's on the field, it negates the effects of all dark monsters that activate on the field or in the graveyard, which is like the 2 most busiest places for dark monsters to activate their effects. Now, the dark attribute is the most popular attribute in the game, and is also the most used one. So, Shadow Imprisoning Mirror sees a lot of play as a side deck addition, and has kind of consistently seen play in the side deck since it was added to the game. They do also have a light version of this card called Light Imprisoning Mirror, which has the exact same effects, but ironically, does not see anywhere near as much play because it's just not as popular as the dark attribute. Light Imprisoning Mirror absolutely does still see play, don't get me wrong. It's just, of the 2 Imprisoning Mirror cards, Shadow Imprisoning Mirror has seen a lot more play over the years. Now, it's not a full negate of their effects, just their activatable ones, which is still so good that it doesn't really matter too much about that little distinction. You can completely counter many decks if you play this card. The only real downside to it is that it also locks you out of using dark attribute monsters as well. And since it's such a popular attribute, there's a good chance you'll have a couple of them in your deck or extra deck that you want to use as well. And at number 3, we have Ancient Fairy Dragon. This card is technically anti-field spell card support like Set Rotation, which is why it makes this list. Although that's not really why this card is currently banned. This is a level 7 synchro monster with generic materials that has 2 effects, where once per turn you can special summon a level 4 or lower monster from your hand. And it also has another once per turn effect, where you can destroy all the field spell cards on the field, gain 1000 life points, then add a field spell card from your deck to your hand. And this second effect is only a soft once per turn. So it was used a whole bunch in different kinds of decks for combos because of how good field spell cards have gotten in the modern era of Yu-Gi-Oh! A lot of them gain effects when they're destroyed, and when they're activated. So with some decks, Ancient Fairy Dragon could allow you to go +2 off of the field spell cards being destroyed and then added back, which doesn't even count the cards it allows you to special summon from your hand in order to further those combo plays. So the card is currently banned because of how good its field spell card effect is, and how easy it is to bring out, and of course the lack of a hard once per turn on it, and not really because it's an anti-field spell card. That's just kind of a bonus. It does destroy your opponent's field spell cards as well, and it was definitely intended to be an anti-field spell card monster, since this card came out back in the days when field spell cards were still kind of mediocre. And at number 2, we have Token Collector. This is anti-support for tokens, where if a token is special summoned, you can special summon this card from your hand or graveyard, destroy all the tokens on the field, give this card 400 attack for each token it destroyed, and then it has a passive floodgate where neither player can special summon tokens. This card is like the ultimate anti-token card, and you can use it from your graveyard, so it's very hard to get rid of if you want to use your tokens. It does have a hard once per turn on its special summon though, so you only have to get rid of it a single time if you want to get rid of its floodgate. But the fact that it nukes the field and then prevents more from coming out is really good for a floodgate. Generally, floodgates don't destroy the cards that they're prevented from being put on the field, and generally they don't allow themselves to come out from the graveyard either. And tokens are very heavily played in the modern metagame, to the point where link monsters that can use tokens for the materials are considered more valuable, in addition to ones that can generate tokens being considered kind of broken. So Token Collector definitely sees competitive play, and kind of does an excellent job at countering the type of monster it was created to counter. So much so that I'm not even sure it's better than number 1 on this list, but the number 1 is just so powerful at its anti-support that it kind of has to take the top spot. And at number 1, we have System Down. This card is anti-support for the machine type, where when you activate this card, you just pay 1000 life points in order to banish all of your opponent's machines on the field and in their graveyard. So this is just a full removal of all of your opponent's monsters if they play nothing but machine type monsters, like a Cyber Dragon deck for example. If you have a whole bunch of cards set up in the graveyard and a full field of monsters, a single System Down resolving is going to end the game for you. You can't really come back from having all of those monsters banished with one card. If it only affected the field or the graveyard, it would still be pretty decent. The fact that it hits both of them at the same time, and then of course does this excellent effect of banishing them, so it bypasses destruction immunity, is just kind of icing on the cake. This is the premier example of an anti-card, and System Down existing single-handedly lowers the power level of machine-type decks, where they have to be very careful to have a negate for this card if it comes up. This card has seen consistent play since its introduction, and routinely sees tons of extra deck play during machine-heavy metas, because you just gain so much from one card if you happen to go against its anti-support. So, while Token Collector is a super good anti-token card, it can just be kind of an inconvenience and something you can play around to an extent, whereas System Down can win you games on its own, which is why it definitely takes the number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. Do you know of any other anti-support cards that are better than the ones I listed that should have made the video? If so, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments, as well as ideas for future videos just like this one. And also, did you know I have a top 10 Dungeons & Dragons channel with videos similar to this one? If you have a passing interest in that subject, you should totally check it out, as I'll be linked in the video description and at the end of the video right now.